Welcome to a guide to EDH Packages. So this is going to be a little different. It's not so much about specific decks, but cards that fit into certain categories for those decks. So before I get to anything else, I would like to show you the EDH Starter Kit. So these are all going to be packages on Moxfield, and what these are here for is basically either as a reference point to the best and most efficient cards in any particular category, or as a way to quickly load in batches of cards to your deck without having to manually type a whole bunch of things and remember them all. So what I like to do is usually when I start work on a new EDH deck, I like to use this EDH Starter Kit because I feel like the cards here are going to be the cards that show up very often in decks, especially dependent on whatever color you are. So if we can go through this via the color of the cards. So I assume that most white decks are going to play Drannith Magistrate, Enlightened Tutor, Esper Sentinel, and Swords to Plowshares. Blue decks are mostly going to play these cards. These are like Counterspells, Psych Rift, Mystical Tutor, and then of course Mystic Remora and Mystic Study. Most black decks probably want to play these cards, a bunch of Tutors, Card Advantage Engines, and Dark Ritual. Most red decks want to play these cards, like, Dockside, Deflecting Swat, the Red Blasts. Most green decks want to play these cards, a whole bunch of monoramp creatures, and things like Carpet of Flowers and whatnot. The land tutors are debatable, like Farseek 3 Visits and Nature's Lore, but I think they show up often enough. Some multicolor cards, like pretty much any deck that can run Death Red, I assume is going to. Same thing with like Fire Covenant. Then of course we've got our colorless, mostly just ramp spells, so things like Mox Diamond, Felwar Stone, Arcane Signet, the talismans for the color decks that are specifically like those two colors are probably going to show up. This is why like the green talismans are not here, because usually green has better ramp sources than talismans. And the One Ring I find is just like good in everything pretty much. And then lands, pretty much any deck that can run these lands is going to. So like the fetch lands in any deck that's more than one color, Ancient Tomb, the dual lands, the shock lands, Cavern of Souls is pretty common. Rainbow lands like City of Brass, Command Tower, Exotic Orchard, and Mana Confluence. Gemstone Caverns, pretty much is in everything. Gaia's Cradles in basically every green deck. The Battle Bond lands like Rejuvenating Springs. And again, these cards are not in every single deck, and sometimes you wind up cutting them, but this is just a good baseline to get started. Sometimes I'll trim like swords out of the white deck, or I won't play like Offer You Can't Refuse. Maybe sometimes I don't want to play Necropotence. Maybe some deck doesn't need Simian Spirit Guide, but for the most part, these are the cards that are pretty much good to start with. And when you do, you just go over here to this Add Packages tab on Moxfield, you click it, and then you just have all the packages that you have ready to go. You click it, it loads in all the cards to your deck, and then you can just trim whichever ones you don't want. So then outside of that starter kit, I also find that there's a lot of lands that wind up in the 2-color deck specifically. So while the 3, 4, and 5 color decks get jammed up with usually fetch lands, dual lands, shock lands, and then sometimes Battle Bond and some other cards, these are the lands, including things like the duels and whatnot, but the lands that are going to be mostly in 2-color decks because they're not good enough to warrant play in the like 3-color decks. And that's not always true. Like sometimes the fast lands and whatnot can get played as well, but these are just going to be the lands that are most often better or inclusions in the 2-color deck. So the Pain lands, the Pathways, the Fast lands, the Slow lands. And then there will be things that are specific to certain colors like Grove of the Burn Willows, Mount Doom, maybe Nimbus Maze and like specifically Azorius decks. The Horizon lands like Nurturing Peatland. And then I'll also include things like Urza's Saga here because I'll find that like Urza's Saga tends to be pretty good, and oftentimes if you're only in 2 colors, you can afford to splash some colorless lands. Then of course there's the 1-color lands. These are like specifically monocolor lands that can be in decks that are more than 1 color, but I tend to include these just in like specifically 1-color decks or maybe 2-color decks if they warrant them. So things like some of the modal double-faced lands, the artifact lands, if your deck has an artifact theme or you care about getting like Mox Opal online, of course basics, and then some other utility lands, things like Academy Ruins, Beseiju, Cabal Coffers in Urborg, Cephalid Coliseum, Nykthos, Sarah's Sanctum if you have enough enchantments to make this good, Yavimaya, Mycosynth Gardens, things like this. And it's a little bit annoying when you add in this package because things like, for example, Urborg and Yavimaya technically don't have green and black symbols in them, so these will show up in the packages, regardless of whatever EDH deck you add them to, but it's simple enough to just trim these out once you add them. And then finally, of course, colorless lands. So again, I usually only add these in like 1 or 2 color decks that can afford to run some colorless specific lands. These are the ones that I tend to find are like the best ones. So like Ancient Tomb is usually going to be in the deck anyway. It's in the starter kit regardless, but it can be in here as well. Blast Zone, Gyreach Sanitarium, sometimes Haste is relevant, so like Call the Bandit Lord, Inventor's Fair, Mishra's Workshop if you are a very, very artifact heavy deck. And there's things like, you know, Temple of the False God maybe can show up. So lands like these. So then you've got ramp. And again, this is when like, so, you know, the EDH starter kit will have most of the ramp spells that I find to be the most common, but this is just everything else that tends to show up in decks. So like if I want more ramp than usual, or maybe I want specific kinds of ramp, you can either add this package in and then selectively trim whatever you don't want, or you can just use this as a reference point. Like maybe you forgot like, oh yeah, Overgrowth, like that's a pretty good one, let me add that, right? So if we sort by mana value, so you're going to start of course with the 0 mana ones, although technically Everflowing Chalice you're always going to pay at least 2 for, but these are like the 0 mana ones. Then at 1 mana you're going to find a lot of the mana dorks, and then a few other cards like Carpet of Flowers, Ragavan. I also include the keys here because a lot of times these basically wind up becoming ramp cards essentially because they untap stuff like Mana Vault. Then at 2 mana, of course, you're going to find all the mana rocks, so cards like Arcane Signet and all the talismans. You also find like all the medallions that make spells cheaper. Of course, this is going to be where you find your Docksides, your Grim Monoliths, your Bloom Tenders, your Devoted Druids. And then there's other things you might not necessarily think about, like Fertile Ground, maybe if untapping lands is relevant, or like enchantments are relevant. Heartless Summoning, kind of a ramp card if maybe creatures don't matter. So like if you've got a non-green black deck that doesn't play Mana Dorks, so you can run this. Things like Kinnon, Lotho, Sanctum Weaver, and Priest of Titania. Of course, the things that fetch lands out like Nature's Lore, Signets. And of course, this isn't the full extent of every single card at 2 mana that ramps. This is just what I find to be the best ones, like the ones that you're going to run the most often if you're looking for more ramp cards than what you find in the base of like the EDH starter kit. Then at 3, we've got stuff like Basalt Monolith, Fabro Elder, Professional Facebreaker, Worn Power Stone. And then at 4, this is where you're going to get your Smothering Tithe, your Grim Hireling, your Thran Dynamo, your Treasonous Ogre, and then Throne of Eldraine. Maybe you could put like Gilded Lotus in here as well, but that's going to be like the ramp cards. So then also next to ramp, you know, ramp adjacent is of course fast mana, and this is where you're going to have cards that they don't permanently stick around. You know, they're not Mana Dorks or Mana Rocks. They either have like a one-shot effect, or they have an effect that is not necessarily repeatable because they require some sort of resource. So this is primarily going to be found in black and red, but there is some in other colors. So there's stuff like Energy Tap, Sacrifice, Culling the Weak, and Burnt Offering, where you like sack a creature or tap a creature to generate mana based on its mana value. You've got other, of course, just generic fast mana spells like Cabal Ritual, Dark Ritual, maybe cards like Blood Pet that are essentially creature versions of Lotus Petal, things like that. Of course, red's going to have a bunch of fast mana as well. Rite of Flame, Seething Song, Sticker Goblin, Orcish Lumberjack in red and green decks. So just various kinds of fast mana. Green has a little bit itself, Elvish Spirit Guide, Metamorphosis, which is like the green version of Sacrifice, Tinderwall, and then of course Jeweled Lotus and Lotus Petal, although I include these in the starter kit as well, so these will usually be here anyway. So then of course, what deck would be complete without Tutors? So if you don't have the Tutors initially, so like the EDH starter kit of course has Tutors in it, but it doesn't have all the Tutors. So this is where you're going to come if you need to branch out into more Tutors. Oftentimes this is because maybe you're like a creature combo deck or an artifact combo deck that has specific Tutors that go get those. So as you can see, we're heavily weighted towards blue, black, and green, but there are Tutors in other colors as well. So in white, you've got obviously Enlightened Tutor, but then like Oswald, Recruiter of the Guard, Weathered Wayfarer. Blue has a lot of spell and artifact Tutors, so Fabricate, Intuition, Merchant Scroll, Tezzeret, Spellseeker, Solve the Equation, the Artifact Mages, Transmute Artifact. Black has a bunch of generic Tutors as well that maybe are like more expensive, less efficient, or more restrictive in some way than Demonic and Vamp Tutor. So things like Beseech the Mirror, Wishclaw Talisman. But then you also get stuff like Entomb, Buried Alive, and Unmarked Grave to put stuff into the graveyard. Red has very few, stuff like Gamble, Goblin Engineer, and Imperial Recruiter. Green, a lot of creature Tutors are going to show up here, so Worldly Tutor, Birthing Pod, Chord, Eldritch Evolution, Crop Rotation to go get lands, oftentimes Gaia's Cradle, GSZ, Finale, Survival of the Fittest, like, you know, cards like these basically. A little bit of multicolor tutors, Eldamri's Call, Fiend Artisan, Limb Duel's Vault, Neoform, Wargate, Rocco. Some artifact, colorless tutors, so like Expedition Map for lands, Moonsilver Key, Koldatha Forge Master, Inventor's Fair. Then of course there's just straight up card draw, so anything that, this is the section for cards that tend to draw multiple cards. Either they immediately draw multiple cards or they can repeatedly draw one card at a time. They like have some kind of whenever something happens trigger or at the beginning of trigger. So these are not cantrips, these are just multiple card draw pieces. Again, mostly they're going to be in the Sultai colors. So in white, you've got stuff like Archivist of Ogma, Esper Sentinel. Blue obviously has a ton of them, so there's of course Mystic Remore and Rhystic Study, but then you've got other big ones like Consecrated Sphinx, Archmage Emeritus, Time Twister. And this is also the section that I include things like looters in, like Careful Study, Ledger Shredder, Frantic Search. So basically effects that either bulk draw a bunch of cards or they like dig through and cycle through multiple cards. So even though technically Careful Study and Frantic Search are card advantage negative, they let you see more cards. So things like that. Black obviously has like Ad Naus, Peer into the Abyss, but there's other cards in here. Bolus's Citadel, Stinging Study, Mindblade Render, Necropotence. Red, Jessica's Will is Impulse Draw, but you know, kind of the same thing. The backside of Bergi as the Harnfell Horn technically draws multiple, obviously Wheel of Fortune. Green has a lot of card draw spells, most of which fall into cards that are based on creatures' power or sacking creatures. So things like Garruk, Last March of the Ants, Greater Good, that kind of effect. But there's also, you know, Sylvan Library, Toski, Beast Whisperer. A little bit over here, like Edric and Timna are based, you know, Toski-esque cards, similar. Hit opponents with creatures, draw cards. There's some card draw in colorless, Memory Jar, Mystic Forge if you're artifact based, Skull Clamp, Ring of course. And then there's a few like lands that are also card draw spells. Then of course, oftentimes you're going to want your removal, or I include bounce spells as part of that. So these are usually cards that hit one specific target, maybe sometimes more than one target, but like, you know, one specific targeted removal spell. These are things that can hit creatures or artifacts and enchantments, or maybe just like any non-land permanent. These are what I tend to include in there. So obviously going to be divided up by colors again. So clearly there's like many different cards that you could include in a removal list. These are the ones I consider to be like the most efficient or valuable in terms of what they do. So stuff like Darksteel Mutation, Fragmentized Loran, Portable Hole, Stroke of Midnight, Skyclave Apparition, like those are the white spells. Blue, some Hydro and Blue Blast stuff maybe, a bunch of bounce spells, of course, you know, Alchemist Retrieval, Machine Over Matter, Chain of Vapor is going to be here. Then there's some other stuff like Dress Down. You're going to get the Darksteel Mutation-esque cards like Eaten Pie Piranhas and Witness Protection. There's some other stuff like Gilded Drake. You know, stealing a permanent is effectively the same thing as like removing it. So this is where these type of effects lie. Submerge. So that's the blue section. Black section, mostly going to be relegated to just killing creatures, obviously. Deadly Rollock, Push, Infernal Grasp, stuff like, you know, Snuff Out, stuff like that. Red, again, more limited. It's mostly going to be burn-based, but can also destroy artifacts. So Abrade, you know, the red blasts obviously are basically removal spells for blue permanents. Bolt, Rending Volley. Then you get like Wild Magic Surge and Chaos Warp to hit anything. Green has some of its own removal as well. Obviously, there's stuff that hits artifacts and enchantments like Force of Vigor, Rex Sage, Nature's Claim, but then you also get certain things like Beast Within, Lignify, Song of the Dryads for like any permanents or other types of effects. Multicolor gets its own stuff. Decay, Trophy, Aura Shards, Vanishing versus Terminate, Teferi, Oko, Haywire, Might, and Colorless. And then some lands also double up as basically kind of removal. So, you know, Otawar and Besage are like the most obvious ones, but then there's also stuff like Mouth of Ronom, Ominous Cemetery, and Underdark Rift that can also get rid of stuff. So maybe if you're, you know, a 2 or less color deck that has some room for lands, maybe you've got a land tutor package like Crop Rotation, and you have, you know, difficulty removing certain types of permanents. Maybe you can include like one of these lands in there as ways of doing that. And then of course, adjacent to removal, you're going to have sweepers, of course. So this is when you need to get rid of multiple things. These are usually going to be fewer cards in your deck than removal, if you even have any. And these are the cards that I consider to be like the best in there in their class, but I do have a lot of them just in case you want to run like more or different kinds of stuff. And I have them broken down into like the kinds of wraths that they are rather than by color. So first off, there's just like everything that just hits all the creatures. So Verdict, Wrath of God, Damnation, Blasphemous Act, these are, Toxic Deluge. Do you just need to like kill every creature? Here's a way to do that. And you're also going to find stuff like Living Death in here as well. Technically, you're not playing this just as a sweeper, but it is a sweeper as well. So that's where you're going to find these types of things. Then these are the sweepers that only hit artifacts and enchantments. So Bane of Progress, Meltdown, Vandal Blast, Seeds of Innocence, like that's this section. Then you're going to have the asymmetric wraths. So these are the ones where usually you build your deck in a certain way, and then the wrath only or mostly affects your opponents and not you. So there is straight up just like Psych Rift and Fire Covenant, which only hit the opponent's stuff. But then there's also things like All is Dust, where, if you're just a colorless deck, then this doesn't hit any of your own things. Or maybe you've got like Time Wipe if you want to play your commander, but then bounce your commander back to your hand so it doesn't die, but all the other creatures die. Things of that nature. Damning Verdict, destroy all creatures with no counters on them. Maybe you have a counter-specific deck where your stuff has counters on it and your opponents probably don't. So this hits those things. Then you've got sweepers that are based on bouncing. So obviously Psych Rift, but then there's stuff like Evacuation and Filter Out. You have what I'm calling delayed wraths. So these are wraths that come in, like sweepers that come in, but they don't immediately go off. You have to like wait until your next upkeep or something. So these are cards like False Prophet, Planar Collapse, and Serenity. Then there's just hits everything. So these are ones that like probably except for lands, they just hit all the non-land permanents. So if you need to do that for some reason, you can. So these are cards like Akroma's Vengeance, Hour of Revelation, Nev Disc, O-Stone. So things like that, where you just need to hit all the non-land permanents. Then you've got the ones that I call mana intensive. So obviously some of these can be considered mana intensive at like 6 mana and whatnot, but these are also just like, cards like Earthquake and Roiling Earthquake, where maybe you'd have to spend a lot of mana to kill everything on the board. Obviously it depends on what's on the board, but so these are going to be like, the X spells. Pernicious Deed is 3 mana and then could potentially be, more than that. Now obviously it depends, because like maybe Pernicious Deed could be even less mana than some of these cards, but in terms of, let's say your opponent has like a 5 mana commander, then, Pernicious Deed plus activating it is going to cost you 8 total. So that's why I consider these like mana intensive. Maybe you could call these, scalable sweepers, where you can spend less or more depending on what's on the board. Then there's modal ones. These are basically just ones that hit like creatures or artifacts or enchantments, or maybe they hit things that are under or over a certain mana value. You've got the ones like Living Death and Scrap Mastery that double as mass reanimation spells. Then this category I call recouping sweepers. So these are sweepers that draw cards or like recoup value in some way. So Decree of Pain, Depopulate, Overwhelming Forces, and Shatter the Sky. These are cards that maybe can like draw you 1 or more cards so that they're both a sweeper and a card draw spell. Then you've got the ones I call restricted wraths or restricted sweepers. So these are ones that they are sweepers, but they're only sweepers for like certain things. So like Brotherhood's End only does 3 damage or only hits artifacts that are under 4 mana value. Calling Ritual only hits things that are mana value 2 or less. Drag to the Bottom only is -X depending on your basic land type count, and then cannot kill anything that's over 5 toughness. Extinction Event only hits odd or even creatures, not both. So, Temp Lockdown is only for mana value 2 or less permanents, things like that. So these are the, restricted sweepers. Then of course, just like the full list of every single sweeper, uncategorized. And yeah, that is basically all the sweepers. Then you've got your counterspells. So obviously there's going to be a certain number of counterspells that are essentially going to be default in every single blue deck, but maybe you want to play more counters than normal or specific types. So, Pact and Negation, like, this counterspell is obviously going to be in some decks, like usually combo decks, and not in every single deck that wants counterspells. You've got all of your 1 mana counters. Some of these, again, are going to be fairly stock and pretty much in everything, like Flusterstorm and Swansong, and, Red Blasts and the red decks. But then others are going to be more restrictive, more niche ones, things like Spell Snare, Stern Scolding, like it depends on what exactly it is you're playing against. Then at mana value 2, like these are the best ones at mana value 2. This big standout one here is probably like Mana Drain, but these other ones can be useful depending on what exactly it is that you're doing. And then at mana values 3 and up, this is where things get really tight, and pretty much just these spells that are not really mana value 3 because they're free, these are where these ones get played. Then you've got protection. So these are not counter spells, although counter spells also double as protection spells. These are basically the spells that are going to protect you or your spells or your life total or your creatures. These break down into a number of different categories, but these are basically things that grant hexproof or protection from colors so that your permanents can't be destroyed by removal. These are the things that are going to make your spells uncounterable. These are the things that are going to make it so your opponent can't attack you, etc. So, looking at this list, so things like Calamity's Wake, Silence, Ranger Captain of Eos, Grand Abolisher, you know, the silence effects that are going to make it so your opponent can't cast spells. So these basically protect you when you're ready to, you know, play combos or maybe like a big payoff spell so your opponent can't interact with you. This is also where you're going to get effects like Ghostly Prison, Moat, and Sphere of Safety so that your opponents can't attack you. Also, where you're going to get stuff that's going to protect your creatures, like Skrelv, Giver of Runes, Mother of Runes, Surge of Salvation, so that your stuff doesn't get picked off by removal. In blue, we've got stuff like Leer, which makes all spells uncounterable. You know, Malevolent Hermit. The backside also makes your non-creatures uncounterable. March of Swirling Mist can be used to hide your creature away for a turn from like a removal or a sweeper. Black, just Imp's Mischief, like, you know, spell redirection. So in red, Deflecting Swat, Bolt Bend, Ricochet, Trap, you know, protection in that regard. This is where you're also going to find cards like Price of Glory, where technically it doesn't prevent your opponent from interacting with you, but if they do choose to tap their lands during your turn, they have to have their lands destroyed. So it doesn't technically protect you, but it does heavily disincentivize them from interacting with you on your turn. In green, you're going to get a lot of, you know, similar effects that we've been going over. So like Allosaurus Shepherd, Autumn's Veil, Veil of Summer, Destiny Spinner, so your stuff can't be countered. City of Solitude and Dosan are going to be the Grand Abolishers in green. Sylvan Safekeeper is going to be green's version of Mother of Runes. Xantid Swarm is the green Silence. Then you also, of course, have Teferi and Vexing Shusher. Colorless, you're going to have stuff that just makes your creatures unkillable because they have hexproof or something. So these are the cards like Lightning Greaves or Spellskite. You also have like Ensnaring Bridge, so your opponents can't attack you. Conqueror's Flail is like the equipment version of Grand Abolisher. You've also got like Defense Grid to tax your opponent's spells during your turn, things like that. And then of course Cavern of Souls, the land that makes your commander uncounterable. Moving on from that, I found that a lot of the times I wanted haste effects. So there's a lot of commanders that have activated abilities that you care about attacking with immediately. Or there's also certain like Voltron commanders where the goal is to deal lethal damage with them really, really fast. Or maybe their effect triggers when you attack with them, so you want to be able to haste them. So this is the cards that are the best and most efficient versions of things that either grant haste or let you activate abilities immediately. So mostly in red, but you do find some without. So like Ashleen's Prerogative, you choose odd or even, and then creatures with that mana value have haste. Things like Mass Hysteria, Need for Speed, and Torch Courier. Of course, green gets Concordant Crossroads. You've also got cards like Tyvar and Thousand Year Elixir that just let you activate creature abilities immediately. You've got Hall of the Bandit Lord, Lightning Greaves, of course. So those are like the haste cards. Obviously, there's many, many more haste cards, but these are the ones I think are like the most efficient versions of them. And then similarly to haste, I found that a lot of decks want untap effects. They will have a commander that has an activated ability that occurs when you tap them. So commanders like Selvala, Krenko, things like that. So this I've mostly broken down into the mana values. So obviously there's an absolute ton of different cards that untap a creature for just a single mana. I wouldn't recommend obviously playing most of these. These are just like all the cards that you could ever look at. I think some of the standout ones are either ones that untap any permanent and not just creatures, so things like Dream's Grip, or that have some other effect like Legolas's Quick Reflexes, also has Split Second, also gives the creature hexproof. Of course, the keys are in here. Anything that can be done multiple times, so like Instill Energy, so that you get to untap next turn as well. Obviously, this is going to be where you find cards like Quirion Ranger and Wirewood Symbiote. Anything that can be part of infinite combos and done repeatedly, so like Seed Cradle Witch, Reconnaissance, those type of effects. Anything that untaps all of your stuff, so like Vitalize and Mobilize, that untap all creatures and not just one single target. And then once you get past 1 mana, the barrier or like the floor that the card needs to be at, you need the card to be a lot more powerful. So this is where you're going to get cards that either like replace themselves or are repeatable, So a Pheto Alchemist and, other creatures that untap creatures with an activated ability, or that untap multiple things like Hidden Strings, Call to Glory, untap all your creatures, obviously Dramatic Reversal, or things that are part of combo chains like Corridor Monitor, Scrib Ranger, of course, Sting, repeatable effects. And then again, once you get past that, so mana value 3 and up is where you're going to start to get like the Kiki Jiki type chain cards, things like Deceiver Exarch and Derevi, or Jeskai Ascendancy, or just the other cards like Intruder Alarm or Pemin's Aura that let you untap stuff over and over and over multiple times. Like these, once you get up to here, these are usually the cards that are part of combo chains. So again, once you start getting to like 3 mana and up, that's where having like a one-off spell that's an instant or sorcery starts to become too inefficient. So these spells need to be able to either be able to activate multiple times or like untap all your stuff, much bigger effects once you get up to 3 mana. And again, as I said before, this is where you start to get like the combo pieces. And then 4 mana and up, again, same type of deal. This is mostly just combo cards or things that untap multiple things. So this is where you get cards like Turnabout or Unwinding Clock to untap stuff every single turn. And then over 4 mana is going to be similar, Seedborn. This is where Seedborn Muse and those type of effects come in. And then also there's some lands that also do untaps, although they're pretty narrow in what they do. But yeah, if you need to have untap effects for whatever reason, then this is a good package to have for that. So then reanimation spells, I find also a lot of decks tend to play reanimation cards. So this is going to cover everything from reanimation spells themselves and all of the various categories that they go into also reanimation enablers. So again, I've broken these down into a number of different categories. So like these first are the cards that only reanimate artifacts and or enchantments. So things like the Welders or Open the Vault. Then you've got your looting spells. So these are like your enablers. So Careful Study, Faithless, Frantic Search, Wheel of Fortune since it discards. So these are going to be the cards that like cycle through and put big creature bomb payoffs in the graveyard. You've got reanimation spells that are creatures. So if being a creature is relevant for whatever reason, like Karmic Guide is used in like Kiki Jiki combos, or maybe you want to tutor a creature directly onto the battlefield and use that to reanimate something. So maybe you like Eldritch Evolution into the Karmic Guide. Then here's just like all the enablers, all the various looting effects, Survival of the Fittest to bin and tutor for stuff, Intuition, Entomb, all of these various effects. Then you've got the reanimation spells that are low mana values only. So cards like Unearth that only reanimate cards that are of a specific low mana value. They can't hit anything. Some decks may want to play cards like these. Then you've got your mass reanimation spells. So these are the spells that return multiple cards. So living, death, and those type of effects. Then of course you just have all the reanimation spells regardless of what category they're in here. And then you've got your restrictive reanimation spells. So these are the ones that are restricted in some way. So like Goryo's Vengeance can only get back a legendary creature. Same thing with Loyal Retainers and Footsteps. Shallow Grave only gets the creature that's in the top pile of your graveyard. Balthor only gets red and black creatures back. Wake the Dead can only be cast during an opponent's combat step, etc. And then you've got your various tutors. So these are just like the tutors that go find stuff. And then your unrestricted reanimation. These are the things that just reanimate anything, like any creature. It doesn't matter the mana value, doesn't matter where the creature is in the graveyard. So these are going to be your usually de facto best reanimation spells. So obviously reanimate, animate dead, things like that. So then you've got your Stax pieces. So oftentimes, when you're building a Stax deck, or maybe you have a deck that has some Stax pieces in it, it's like not a dedicated Stax deck, but you just want some Stax pieces. And maybe you forget, there's a Stax piece that would be really good in your deck, but you don't remember it. Or you just want to like dump all the Stax cards into your deck and then pick out which ones you want to keep. So this, you can just import the entire Stax package over to your deck and then cut out any of the ones that you don't want, or just use this as a reference point. So again, I've got this broken down into the different types of whatever Stax card they are. So we've got anti-activations. So these are, most notably cards like Collect Roof, Stony Silence, and Null Rod. So these all shut off artifacts, but they're not just for anti-artifacts. You've got stuff like Linvala to shut off activated creature abilities like Linvala, Drawn on Linvala, and Curse Totem. Pithing Needle, Sorcerer's Spyglass, Phyrexian Revoker for specific cards like Commanders. You've got anti-cheat stacks. This is the stuff that prevents your opponent from like reanimating or like natural ordering in stuff. So these are your cards like Grafdigger's Cage, Soulless Jailer, and Weathered Runestone. You've got your anti-card draw stacks pieces that either prevent your opponents from drawing extra cards or punish them for doing so. So cards like Chains, Narset, Spirit of the Labyrinth, and Possessed Portal just flat out stop your opponent from drawing. Notion Thief replaces your opponent's draws with you drawing instead. And then you've got your cards like Orcish Bowmasters and Shieldred with punish your opponent's draws. You got your anti-search effect, so Opposition Agent would be the face card of this category. You've got your anti-spell cards, so these are cards that stop you from casting certain types of spells. So spells that are free or spells that are of a specific mana value or type. So cards like Lavinia are in this section. You've got your anti-enter the battlefield trigger cards. So Elesh Norn, Hushbringer, and Torpor Orb. There are other cards like Hushwing Grift and whatnot that are in this category, but I think these are the most efficient versions, like the best ones of these cards. And I typically don't tend to play any of the other ones if I already have these ones. Then you've got your anti-untap. So these are cards that mess with untapping your land, so stuff like Back to Basics and Winter Orb, or Stasis when you have Stasis Hardlocks. You've got your Color Screw, so Blood Moon's the face card here, but there's other stuff like Contamination that also messes with the ability to tap your lands for a given mana. You've got Forced Tap effects, so these are cards that either tap down your opponent's permanents or that make them come into play tapped. So this is stuff like, Kismet, Root Maze, things like that, Opposition to keep them tapped down, Tangle Wire. Obviously, you've got Graveyard Hate, so Rip, Leyline of the Void, Dothy Voidwalker. That's where this section is in. You've got your LD, so Armageddon and those type of effects, but it's not just Armageddon. You've also got stuff like Ruination or Desolation to pick off lands. You've got your, of course, Rule of Laws to prevent players from casting multiple spells in a turn, your Archon of Emerias, your Deafening Silences, these effects here. Damping Sphere is technically not a rule of law, but the tax effect adds up so fast that it's essentially a rule of law. Then just all the Stax cards, regardless of what category they're in. I didn't really know what category to put Drannith Magistrate in. I guess technically it's like an anti-spell card specifically for the commander, but I just chose to label this Targeted Hate. Then you've got Taxes, so this is anything that's making spells cost more or otherwise interfere with them. So there's the cards that just straight up make things cost more, like Thalia. But then there's other stuff that taxes you for having permanents, things like Kataki, Tabernacle, Trinisphere, makes spells cost more if they cost less than 3. Energy Flux is another Kataki. Then you've also got cards like Mana Breach. Whenever any player casts a spell, they have to bounce a land back to their hand. Or Overburden. Whenever a player has a creature enter the battlefield under their control, they have to bounce a land back. So these are sort of also taxing effects in a sense. And yeah, that is going to make up all of the Stax cards. So then sometimes the deck that I wanted to play is a tribal deck, and rather than having to go and fish out tribal cards every single time, I just wanted them in their own package. Now, obviously, this doesn't include every single tribal card for every single tribe. There's going to be many tribal cards that are specific to their certain tribe. So these are more the tribal cards that can go in any deck regardless of what creature type it is. So things like Everything Comes to Dust, where it's a sweeper that doesn't sweep any of the creatures of the type that you convoked with it. Distant Melody and Pact of the Serpent draw cards based on however many creatures you have of a specific type. Or like Patriarch's Bidding reanimates all the creatures of a specific type. Crippling Fear is a -3 sweeper that doesn't affect the creature type that you choose. You got stuff like Mana Echoes, Shared Animosity, Steely Resolve shrouds all creatures of a certain type. Cards like Coat of Arms, Urza's Incubator, Cryptic Gateway. So this tends to be like a good starting point whenever you put a tribal deck together of just like solid cards that care about creature types regardless of whatever creature type it is that you're playing. And so yeah, that makes up pretty much all of the packages that I tend to build with. Now, maybe there's a category of cards that you might want to include regardless of any ones that I already have here, but these are the ones that I tend to find to be just like useful shortcuts to quickly adding things to decks, either by just adding them via the add package ability of Moxfield, or just as a good reference point where like, oh yeah, that card, I forgot about that card, I'll add that to the deck. But anyways, yep, that is packages for EDH.